Michael Barone, Norm Ornstein, and Henry Olson, and our C-SPAN viewers, I'd like to invite all of you to this final session of the AEI Election Watch 2012 seasons. I'd like to briefly introduce one of our colleagues, Ben Wattenberg, who helped to start the AEI Election Watch series in 1982. He's with us here today. Ben Wattenberg and the late Richard Scammon were the first people to look at the interaction of demography and public opinion data in their 1970 book, The Real Majority. They told us how important changing demographics would be to future elections, and in this election, their path-breaking insights have been confirmed. Latinos were a larger share of the electorate than 4 years ago, and they voted, as this new issue of AEI's monthly political report shows, solidly for President Obama. If Romney had done as well with Hispanics as Reagan did in 1984 and Bush in 2004, the outcome of this election would have been different. Between the 2000 and 2010 censuses, Asians were the fastest growing ethnic group in the country, and in this election they also voted heavily for the president. African Americans are a very slow-growing demographic group, but their turnout did not decline this year, and they gave more than 90% of their votes to the president. So while demography is not destiny, it is certainly important. The demographer Joel Kotkin has said that demography is the best friend the Democrats have. Scammon and Wattenberg talked about the Dayton housewife as key to the vote in 1972. In this election, women were 53% of the electorate, and they voted solidly for Obama. Men voted for Romney. White, black, and Hispanic women were more Democratic than white, black, and Hispanic men. The gender gap lives at 18 percentage points. Women in Ohio voted for Obama. Men in Ohio voted for Romney. The marriage gap was a whopping 41 points, with married voters decidedly Republican in this election, and the growing group of non-marrieds overwhelmingly Democratic. All of these data are in our new AEI political report prepared by Andrew Rugg, and we also want to thank Claude Aubert for getting this report done with all of the latest 2012 data from 22 key demographic groups available for you today. The demographic changes are being felt in Congress, too. David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report wrote that for the first time ever, white men will no longer be a majority of the Democratic caucus. In 1953, he says, there were 98% of House Democrats and 97% of House Republicans. Along with the demographic data, the exit polls showed that Obama was able to diffuse the economic issue, and he won overwhelmingly on empathy. We're going to begin today with Michael Barone, who will tell us what happened and why. All of us on this panel have made election predictions over the course of election watching. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong. In his Washington Examiner column yesterday, Michael said flatly, "I was wrong." But he followed up with the line, "I take some pleasure in finding that I have been wrong because it is an opportunity to learn more." I think we all share that sentiment. After Michael speaks, we're going to turn to Henry Olson to talk about what defeat means for the Republican Party. The firing squad has assembled and the recriminations phase has begun. The Washington Times has said this morning in an editorial that Chris Christie should be excommunicated. And Jenny Beth Martin, head of the Tea Party Patriots, had this to say about Romney. He was weak, moderate, handpicked by the establishment and the Beltway elites. It does not work, she said, and it is time to find someone the next time who embraces our values. Henry will tell us what lessons the party should learn from this election. Henry, by the way, called the popular vote on the nose in this election. He and Nate Silver deserve the kudos overall. Finally, we're going to turn to Norm to talk about what this election means for the House and the Senate and the fiscal cliff. I should report that Norm's book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, is once again, here it is for all of you, a great Christmas gift. It's number 20 on Amazon today. It's been on the bestseller list almost consistently since it appeared. We want to ask Norm whether or not the Republicans have a lock on the House going forward and what the new Congress is going to tell us about future events. Michael, we'll begin with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlin, and thank you for noting my fallibility. It's been there since I told all my law school classmates that Nelson Rockefeller was going to be defeated for re-election in 1966, and I should have remained shy about predictions after that one. Barack Obama won this election by a 50 to 48% margin. That may go up to a rounded off 51-48 when votes from California come in. California, the last time, took 5 weeks to count its votes. They count them in 5 hours in Brazil. I'm not sure why California is so much less technologically advanced, but there we are. So all these figures are necessarily a little incomplete as they apply to the nation. There's some other states with votes still out, too. It appears that Obama will get a huge electoral vote advantage out of this relatively narrow popular vote margin, assuming that he carries Florida, where he is in current counts ahead, and the Miami-Dade County people are this year counting votes without the assistance of many Republican and Democratic lawyers. With Florida, his electoral victory is 332 to 206. That's, Bush with a 51-48 margin in 2004 only got 286 votes. Obama with slightly less, it appears, gets 332. I think there's a certain structural demographic advantage for Democrats in the Electoral College in this era. Democratic voters tend to be clustered in some big, large metropolitan areas, and in particular neighborhoods of them, and they give the Democrats an initial advantage in the Electoral College. President Obama got 57% or more of the popular vote in 11 states in the District of Columbia, and they have 163 electoral votes. Romney won 13 states by such margins, but they only have 104 electoral votes. So basically, the Democrats have a bigger hunting ground, a larger base in the Electoral College, and a bigger hunting ground to go find those votes. And Barack Obama, in 2 campaigns, has been very successful with 365 and apparently 332 this time, at 303 if he doesn't carry Florida. This election cycle has been compared by many people to 2004, the re-election of an incumbent president by mobilizing supporters and getting them out. I think it's actually a little more like 1996, which was a different election. In one respect, it clearly was. Turnout was way up in 2004, from 105 million in 2000 to 122 million in 2004. Turnout was down in 1996. I have a hypothesis that when economic issues are at issue, economic contentment in 96, economic discontent in 2012, it doesn't bring voters as much to the polls as when non-economic or cultural issues or war peace issues are at issue, as they seem to be in 2004. In one respect, it was unlike both 1996 and 2004. Clinton and Bush both won with increased margins. Clinton's 49% in 96 would have been 51 or 52 if you split the Perot vote according to second choices, and that was an increase from his 43% in 1992. Bush pushed his popular vote up from 48% to 51%. Obama, however, declined from 53% to 50% or possibly 51%. His victory was a victory for big government policies. Obamacare will surely stay in place, and obviously the president and the Democratic majority in the Senate will have a lot to say on fiscal issues, which Norm will, I gather, will discuss. Less of a victory, I think, for big government ideas. I mean, Clinton pivoted to the center on issues, and voters, while not enthused, gave him larger percentages. Obama ran essentially a negative campaign against Romney with the firewall strategy, spending about half of the pre-convention dollars and energy on the 3 firewall states of Florida, Ohio, and Virginia, which, aside from Indiana and North Carolina, at one point in victories in 2008, were the lowest percentage states for Barack Obama. Those states together have 60 electoral votes, and they obviously were important. With them, Obama would appear to have 332 electoral votes. Without them, he'd have 272, which would mean only one other state would have tipped. Now, there's not a likely candidate as you look down the percentages in this election, but it was nonetheless close. And I think this proved to be effective. He's currently carrying Florida by 46,000 votes, Ohio by 107,000, and and Virginia by 100,000. Those 253,000 vote margins are responsible for his big electoral vote margin. It's a classic example of a high-risk strategy. The Obama strategists are now going to be hailed with some appropriateness as brilliant for employing this strategy. If a few numbers had turned out a little differently, they might be excoriated, but the fact is that they succeeded. And I think when you compare movement in the target states and non-target states, if you look at the 8 target states, Colorado, Florida, Iowa, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, Ohio, Virginia, Obama's percentage only declined 1.5% from 2008. In the rest of the country, whether you're talking about solidly Republican or solidly Democratic states or the kind of late target states, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Obama's percentage was down 2.8%, about double the amount. That he still would carry the rest of the country, aside from the target states, but not as big a percentage. One of the fascinating things about this election is that an electorate that believes that things are moving in the wrong direction and has been giving Congress dismal job ratings, reelected a Democratic president, retained got an even more a Democratic Senate with some powerful assists from some Republican candidates, I wonder if they've investigated the possibility of moles. Anyway, and they retained a Republican House. I've got an article in the Wall Street Journal coming out tomorrow on this issue, on the House issue. Republicans, according to the current count, have a net loss of only 6 seats in the House, and they started off as compared to 2012 results when they won, or 2010 when they won 242. That's bigger than the majorities they had when Newt Gingrich and Dennis Hastert were speakers, and that's despite apparently losing, and these counts will change a little as the final results are tabulated, that losing 5 seats each in Illinois and California in redistricting. Republicans nonetheless had minimal losses here. And so this is another way it's different from 1996. Clinton in 96 won by a wider majority. Republicans barely held on to a majority in the House. This year, Obama won by a narrower majority, and Republicans retained a big House, retained a relatively large House majority, although not as large as Democrats had after 2006 and 2008 elections. So I think John Boehner has some basis for saying that if the president has a mandate, so do House Republicans. Popular vote for the House Republicans will probably come out to something like the same 50 to 48 by which Obama beat Romney. That hasn't been fully tabulated yet. Back about 20 years ago, circa 1990, political scientists and pundits said that Republicans had a lock on the presidency and Democrats had a lock on the House. And they had all sorts of good reasons why this was so. Well, the Democrats picked the lock on the presidency in 1992. Republicans broke the lock on the House in 1994. Starting with those elections, Democrats have won 4 of the 6 presidential elections and won a plurality of popular vote in another. Republicans have won majorities in 6 out of 8 elections for the House of Representatives. So this is, no, it's 8 out of 10, 8 out of 10 in the House of Representatives. Looking back from 2014, back 20 years to 1994, we will have had during that period for 10 years a Democratic president and a Republican House. 2 things that people in 1990 said could never happen. So it's something like the new normal. The period before 1990, the normal was Republican president, Democratic House. It seems to be the reverse there. And that happens, I think, the demographic reason is that Democratic votes are clustered in those big metropolitan areas. John McCain in 2008, Barack Obama in 2008 won 28 congressional districts with 80% of the vote or more. John McCain won 0 by that margin. That gives Democrats a lot of votes in those big states, but it also means that there's not that many Democrats in adjacent districts. This time, Obama probably carried about the same number of states with that percentage. Romney may have gotten that percentage in 1 or 2 districts in Utah. Maybe it's time for political scientists and us political pundits to roll out another rule about locks, who has a lock on which part of the government, before that rule too becomes obsolete. Thank you.
Thank you, Norm. Now, Henry, tell us about the Republican Party.
I think the temptation for Republicans, as in any cases with going through this 5 stages of grief, is first going to be engaging in denial. And that's what you saw with the Washington Times pieces that Carlin read today. It's understandable. It's the human response, but it would be very smart for the Republicans to get farther along those stages and not stay in the denial stage very long. Because when we look at what we have to face, it is not a hopeless picture, but it is not a pretty one. Carlin's talked about the demographic changes. That is something that there is nothing that any Republican candidate can do anything about. Even if we stopped immigration 100% tomorrow, which frankly no one wants to do, the numbers that are already baked into the citizenship cake means that the share of whites are going to continue to decline over the next 20 years as the American electorate, and the share of non-whites is going to continue to rise. Because of longevity differences between males and females, the share of women in the electorate is going to slightly rise over that period because, very frankly, as people live longer, men will die at 80 and women will live to 90. So we'll have a slightly larger share of women in the electorate as well. It's really not a good idea to ignore facts. And the one fact I would like to focus on for my presentation today is a exit poll number that has not gotten a whole lot of attention, but I'm single-handedly trying to resurrect it. And that is, at the end of the exit poll, the voters were asked, which of the following 4 qualities is most important to you in selecting a president? Romney won 3 of those, and he won each of those by double digits. He was the selection of the people who said that they most valued having a strong leader. He was the choice of the people who said they most valued somebody who had a strong vision for the country. And he was the choice of the people who said that they most valued having someone who shared their own values. The reason Mitt Romney is not president today, and I submit the reason why conservatism generally has been locked in a 50% ceiling nationwide since the end of the Cold War, even though sometimes we can translate that into majorities in the House, is because of the last group. The last group is about 1/5 of the electorate, and that question is the thing that they valued most is somebody who cares about people like them, cares about people like me. Mitt Romney lost that group 81-18. Now, when you lose 20% of the electorate by 63 points, that's a problem. And it makes sense that you would do this in light of the campaign that both candidates ran, but particularly the campaign that the Obama campaign ran, which was simply a modernization of the campaign that Democrat candidates turned to in difficult times ever since the New Deal coalition won in 1932. In Canada, the Conservative Party won the most recent elections by tarnishing the leader of the Liberal Party, and in a parliamentary system that's basically akin to campaigning against the presidential candidate, Michael Ignatieff. And Michael Ignatieff was a Harvard professor who was a Canadian native who returned to his country to run for parliament and was the Liberal Party candidate. And the Liberal Party had dominated Canada since the Great Depression. And what they did was they systematically painted him as somebody who, by his experience and his ideas, was out of touch with the aspiration of the ordinary Canadian. And their television ads had a tagline that was brutal and succinct. He didn't come back for you. The Obama campaign wasn't so brutal in its overt message, but was as brutal in its covert message. The message that they decided on was essentially to say that the Romney Republican agenda, and they were always very clever in tying the man to his party, is he and they are not running for you. And they did it on the level of values. For women, what was the war of women against women about? What was the contraception issue about? But to say they don't understand you, they don't care about you, they don't value you, they're not running for you. What was Bain about? What was tax cuts for the wealthy about? It was to talk to the blue-collar, struggling worker, white, black, Hispanic, or Asian, who struggles from paycheck to paycheck, may go through periods of uninsurance each year, to say, when it comes to the economy, they think that the way is to give their friends more money and hope that they do well by you. You don't believe that, they're not running for you. Latinos, that's what the immigration issue was about. You want to be part of the American dream? They won't even pass the DREAM Act. They're not running for you. Does anyone have any question as to why, with those series of arguments and that series of consistency that ties and interweaves into a melange that makes sense, why 21% of Americans who think that caring about people like them is the most important feature in the national leader, why they would select the person who was making that argument against the person who was said not to be running for them. Now, Republicans have to admit that as much as that is a caricature of Romney and as much as that is a caricature of Republicans, caricatures only work if they make sense in light of the person being caricatured. As even Joseph Goebbels said, propaganda itself has to have a kernel of truth at its core. So what Republicans need to do is take a very hard look at ourselves. And Republicans need to ask, if that's how a fifth of Americans overwhelmingly perceive us, what do we need to do to change? Because Americans of all shades and sexes want a government that's on their side, that supports their values, and it's not a paternalistic thing they want. A lot of the people who voted for President Obama and voted for Democrats also answered the question, do you want a bigger government or a smaller government? On the smaller government side. What they don't believe is that the Republican Party is someone who understands that the use of government is legitimate and can be effective in giving them a hand up in American life. They don't want a hands-off society. They don't want, as President Obama said, the you're on your own society. And they don't want the handout society, the heavy hands-on society that Republicans accuse Democrats of purveying. They want a hand up. They want a limited but energetic government, and the Republican Party has to recognize that that's the crucial segment of the electorate that consistently does not vote for Republicans who could vote for Republicans. I'm going to close with reading from a speech that I wrote about in the National Review in an article called Open Your Heart Myth. And it's what Richard Nixon said at the end of his acceptance speech for the 1968 nomination. It'll take a minute or two, but I think you'll see why I'm going to do this when I do it. He said towards the end of his speech that tonight I see the face of a child. He lives in a city. He is black or he is white. He's Mexican, Italian, Polish. None of that matters. What matters is that he's an American. That child is more important than any politician's promise. He is America. He is a poet, a scientist, a great teacher, a proud craftsman. He is everything we ever hoped to be and everything we dare to dream to be. He sleeps the sleep of childhood, and he dreams the dreams of a child. And yet when he awakens to a nightmare of poverty, neglect, and despair. He fails in school. He ends up on welfare. For him, the American system is one that feeds his stomach and starves his soul. It breaks his heart. And in the end, it may take his life on some distant battlefield. To millions of children in this rich land, that is their prospect of the future. But this is only part of the America I see. I see another child tonight. He hears the train go by, and he dreams of faraway places where he'd like to go. It seems like an impossible dream. But he's helped on his journey through life. A father who had to go to work before he finished the 6th grade, sacrificed everything so that his sons could go to college. a gentle Quaker mother with a passionate concern for peace who quietly wept when he went to war but understood why he had to go. A great teacher, a remarkable football coach, an inspirational manager, all encouraged him on his way. A courageous wife and loyal children stood by him in victory and in defeat. And in his chosen profession of politics, first there were scores, then hundreds, then thousands, and finally millions who worked for his success. And tonight he stands before you, nominated for the President of the United States. You can see why I believe so deeply in the American dream. For most of us, the American Revolution has been won. The American dream has come true. And what I ask you to do tonight is to help me make that dream come true for millions to whom it's an impossible dream today. Ladies and gentlemen, when a Republican leader can read that word and read that speech without a hint of irony, with full measure of sincerity, and being able to insert the female pronoun for the male as it's appropriate, then the Republican candidate will be rewarded with the presidency. The Republican Party will be rewarded with the majority that it's sought for 80 years, and we'll see what a Republican government can do for America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And now on to best-selling author, Norm Ornstein.
Thanks, Carlin. First, I want to suggest to everybody in the room and in the audience, if you have not read Henry's pre-election memo, which is at National Review Online, do it, even though the election is over, because it's not just about having the numbers spot on. It's about what's behind it. The analysis is the best you'll see about why the electorate is breaking down the way it is and where it was going, and so I give him a big shout-out on that. Now, I want to say just a mea culpa, as Carlin said about Michael, we've all been wrong at times, and I was wrong on the choice of a running mate for Mitt Romney. I predicted he would choose Newt Gingrich. I thought it was the perfect balance ticket, a Mormon and a polygamist. I was wrong about the marijuana initiatives. I thought they would fail because I thought there'd be a substantial number of supporters who would wake up on Wednesday morning and say, hey, dude, was that election yesterday? And I missed that one as well. But I also want to give a comment about somebody else who's perhaps our most astute prognosticator and analyst. Of course, that's Dick Morris. And just say that the best line of the year by far is from David Axelrod, who said the other day, I have had a foot in my mouth many times over the years, but it's always been my own. So thank you, David. That one, every time you see Dick Morris on television, and believe me, he will be on at least as much, if not more, in the future. Think about that. Now, on to Congress, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the elections themselves, although it is, of course, so interesting that for a country which is fed up with politicians and politics, angry at where we are and about the dysfunction, that we do end up with the status quo ante. But there are a couple of interesting elements to that. 6 months or a year ago, maybe 3 months ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, none of us would have said with any level of confidence, much less believed, that Democrats would pick up 2 seats net in the Senate, or that they would lose only one of their own. There were 23 Democratic seats up. Going into this cycle, we thought half of them were highly vulnerable. There were 10 Republican seats, and going in, we thought no more than one perhaps would be vulnerable. That Republicans lost several of their own was in significant part attributable to what Michael said, and the fact is, of course, the same thing happened in 2010 in this sweeping election where Republicans won 63 seats in the House, huge numbers of seats at the state level and legislative level, and could easily have captured a majority but didn't. It was because of instances of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory in states from Nevada with Sharon Angle as the nominee, to Delaware with Christine O'Donnell. And this time you could easily say it at least about 2 and probably more of those races. Now, I don't think it's a matter of Democrats having inserted moles into the Republican Party. I think it relates to just what Henry has been talking about. You have a party now that is driven and dominated by a wing which is not conservative but radical, I believe. And it's a problem at the presidential nominating process level. It's a problem at the congressional nominating process level. It's a problem in primaries as we go ahead, and it has great relevance for whether we are actually going to be able to find some of that common ground that we have been talking about. With that, and just a word or two about the House. Democrats needed a net of 25 seats to capture a narrow majority. Looks like they will probably win 25 or more Republican seats. But you have to take into account whether you lose any of your own. And they lost a number of their own. Now, there were a couple of surprise victories on their part of moderates who we did not expect would prevail. John Barrow in Georgia was redistricted for the second consecutive time to a seat that should have been an absolute loser for him. But he prevailed, and not by just a handful of votes. And it's a template for how you can run as a Democrat in a conservative area, and a smart guy. And Jim Matheson in Utah, in a seat where an enormous amount of money went in. I was out in Utah and bumped into George Will at the airport. He had been there doing an event for Mia Love, an African-American, young, conservative Mormon Republican. Now, that is a mouthful, and an immigrant, and a attractive candidate. But Matheson, who knew how to run in the district, prevailed. So there's still opportunities for moderate Democrats, but the numbers are down. They're down from what they were in 2010 going in. They're down now as well. And on the Republican side, the other factor here was that in many states, the redistricting did provide Republicans a firewall where losses otherwise would have occurred. In North Carolina, Democrats captured a majority of votes for Congress statewide, and they ended up with 3 out of 12 seats. That tells you something about the power of redistricting. It worked on both sides, but Republicans built a firewall that worked very well for many of their potentially vulnerable freshmen and other members, and also built in some advantages that caused some Democratic losses. So that's where we are. The relevance of the Democratic gains of 2 in the Senate are significant because with 55, what should be and will be another enormous Republican advantage in 2014. 20 Democratic seats up to only 13 Republican. And here again, the Republican seats on the surface look very safe. They're, in states where it's unlikely that you would see losses, but you could see once again a few of those occasions where victory is denied because of nomination struggles. And Democrats have several seats that could be more vulnerable. But if you're within 1, 2, or 3, then you can pretty much count on a majority, and it changes how you behave in the next 2 years. If you need 5 or 6, now it would be 6, that becomes a very different matter, and it makes it harder, and it may mean that the willingness of some in the Senate to work towards compromises now rather than wait, believing that you're going to be in a much stronger position in 2015 will be greater. But there's another factor to keep in mind for 2014. Among those who are up in 2014, Mitch McConnell, John Cornyn, Lindsey Graham, Saxby Chambliss. Now, if you're Mitch McConnell, and if we had been sitting here 4 years ago, we would have had unanimity that Mitch was king of the Republican Party in Kentucky. And there was not even a contest for who was the utterly acknowledged leader. Then we get to the 2010 elections, and he put every resource he could, every attempt, every string he could pull to keep Rand Paul from winning the Republican nomination, and failed miserably. If you're looking at this from McConnell's perspective, knowing that several of the Republicans who ran for the Senate this time would not promise going in that they would support Mitch McConnell, and you know that you have the potential for a primary challenge in a party you no longer control, your willingness to compromise on some of these critical issues may be itself compromised. If you're John Cornyn, you'd have stayed out of the race in for the Republican nomination for the Senate this time around, but you sat back and watched as the very conservative and powerful lieutenant governor, the most powerful figure in the state, was beaten from one end of the state to the other in the primary by Ted Cruz because he was a moderate. And you got to be thinking, that could happen to me. And if you're Lindsey Graham, you go in knowing that you're the number 1, number 2, and number 3 targets of the Club for Growth, which has already said that they'll spend whatever it takes to defeat you. And you know that a majority of local Republican committees in South Carolina have basically declared that you're a socialist. So one of the absolute model problem solvers has to think a little bit about whether he'll fall on grenades right now. And if you're Saxby Chambliss, one of the courageous members of the Gang of Six, now Gang of Eight, who's put himself on the line for a budget deal, Georgia is not exactly a place where you can expect a placid primary either. So factor those dynamics and keep in mind that the number 1 and number 2 leaders will be Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn. Now, with all of that, we had some interesting messages from the 2 Republican leaders on election eve and the day that followed. On election eve, John Boehner said, as Michael noted, hey, we've got as much of a mandate as he does, but then softened it the next day by saying we want to work with the president and we know we need a budget deal and we know we need some revenues from that budget deal. Mitch McConnell, on the other hand, despite suffering a significant loss for his party in the Senate, was pugnacious and said there is no mandate for the failed policies of the president, and cooperation, he better come to us and understand that it's going to, if it doesn't pass through the House, it's a dead letter. Now, you might take from that you've got some real opportunities in the House and nothing in the Senate, but the opposite is true. The fact is, whether Mitch believes it or not, or was saying it for effect right now, the Senate has a group of problem solvers who've been waiting to bust out after this election. And we've already seen it behind the scenes in the 2 months leading up to November 6th with the Gang of 8 and now what is really a gang of 40. 40 senators, 20 from each party, who've been working with Simpson and Bowles, and now for the first time, what has been an absent business community, absent without leave throughout the debt limit debate, for example, now very much engaged to try and come up with a resolution both of the fiscal cliff, but also one that takes us further towards at least a sizable additional down payment on the larger debt problem, and it will almost certainly fit the templates of Simpson Bowles, Rivlin Domenici, and the Gang of Six, which means a total of $4 trillion over 10 years. It's only going to be a template. There is no plan. There's never been a plan. It's all just guidelines. But 1 to 1.3 trillion of it coming from revenues, along with commitments to serious restraint on all the entitlement programs, including Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and restraint on defense and domestic programs, but not done through sequesters. Probably with those guidelines and then orders to the relevant committees in Congress, no super committee created, to come up with specific plans and the revenues via a tax reform plan. Now, that may be one in which McConnell does not participate, or it may be one in which he votes against, mindful of 2014. But I don't think this time he can do what he did so masterfully for 4 years, which is to get everybody in unison, voting against things and voting for filibusters on everything. And a group of people that will include Lamar Alexander and Bob Corker and Saxby Chambliss and Mike Crapo and Tom Coburn and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and a number of others are going to be moving somewhat in a different direction. The House, however, if you parse Boehner's words a little bit further, it was, we know there have to be more revenues and we can get them through more tax cuts. It was cut the rates and the revenues will come in. There is no commitment to something more than that, and you have 90% or more of the House Republicans who continue to stand by Grover Norquist's pledge. That makes that kind of a plan emerging problematic. And the question becomes, will they get a plan together and get those senators, which could probably pass the Senate with 65 or 70 votes, and which I believe would be immediately endorsed by Obama, to even bring it up for a vote in the House, where bringing it up for a vote means that almost certainly it will have to, if it passed, come with more Democrats supporting it than Republicans. That means Mitch McConnell, or excuse me, that means John Boehner falling on a grenade. Now, you could do that, but when you have Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy eager to reach under your belly and pull the pin on that grenade, it makes it a little bit harder because you're not going to have a unified leadership to support this. And it will be a very interesting dynamic. What struck me the most about statements on election eve in a related vein was what Barack Obama said. Extraordinarily, I thought. I want to sit down with Mitt Romney to see how we can work together to find that common ground. Now, my guess is that Romney did not receive that statement with great enthusiasm and eagerness. He was going through his own period of mourning, but having run a campaign in the last month that was built around the idea, I will find that common ground, I can reach that common ground. If Obama calls him in and says, we really need this, you know, we're about to go off the fiscal cliff, would you help me build support for this deal that will have the support of the business community and a supermajority in the Senate in a bipartisan way? That would be an interesting phenomenon. At the same time, we had an announcement today by Simpson and Bowles, bolstered by something like $35 million in business support for going aggressively on the road to promote this kind of plan. And my guess is that one of the first calls that Obama will make now is to his old friend Tom Coburn to come in. And imagine the power in December, if it happened, of a meeting at the White House with Tom Coburn on one side, Simpson and Bowles behind you, probably not Mitt Romney, but possibly, and Jamie Dimon and Jeff Immelt and a few other business leaders with you saying, we've heard the American people's plea for us to finally get together and solve these problems. You saw what we did with Hurricane Sandy. We can do this with the hurricane of the debt and the fiscal cliff coming, if only we can get it up to a vote in the House. Now, that may not happen, and it may be that they cannot reach a deal on this plan because there's no plan and there's no easy procedural way to get a vote that would guarantee a few months down the road that you would actually meet those targets. And frankly, finding a tax reform plan that raises $1 trillion in revenues is far trickier than the 1986 tax reform, which cut rates, broadened the base and eliminated deductions, but was revenue neutral. That was tough enough. But if they can manage to find that, we may see that dynamic emerge. Now, I'll make just two other quick points. One is the very interesting role that Paul Ryan will play from this point on. Paul Ryan was simultaneously a loser and a winner on Tuesday night. A winner because he won his House seat, a loser for the obvious reason, but also for a couple of additional ones. It's kind of embarrassing when you're put on a ticket and you can't carry your own state. But also his percentage in his own district went down significantly. At the same time, there is no question that Paul Ryan, who was a national figure but far more recognized by those of us in the intellectual world and the commentariat than by others. Paul, a year ago, could have walked through any airport outside of Wisconsin or Washington in America and might well have gone unnoticed, maybe by one or two people. Now, obviously, he is an enormously significant national figure and clearly one in the mix for 2016. But he's in the mix for that kind of conservative community that has dominated the primary and caucus process before. And going along with these kinds of compromises that include tax increases as part of a package becomes a little trickier for him. And it also becomes trickier for Boehner because now you've got three young guns, one of whom is an even more enormous national figure. Finally, let me just say, the next few weeks are not just about the fiscal cliff. We have a farm bill waiting for action. A farm bill that passed the Senate with 74 votes. And this is an interesting template as we talk about the fiscal cliff. In the Senate, model of bipartisanship. Even in the midst of the greatest drought since the Great Depression, the House didn't act. And whether they can act now, you had an Agriculture Committee chair desperate to bring up a bill, had bipartisan support, a leadership that felt it would have a conservative revolt if it brought it up, is still hanging. And then you've got a cybersecurity bill. And this is interesting in another way. This was a bill that emerged in the Senate with Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman, who are extremely close, and another bipartisan action that was blocked by Lieberman's closest friends in the Senate, other than Susan Collins, John McCain and Lindsey Graham. And it caused some enormous tensions. Will they find a way out of that, and what will be Joe Lieberman's last hurrah in the Senate, and what he wants, and what is an extremely important, and one certainly could argue urgent priority, because we know there are people all over the world working night and day to bring about a cybersecurity terrorist attack, and they are in governments as well as outside. And also knowing that if there is no action, there will be steps taken by executive fiat that would be even more obnoxious. Can we overcome that dysfunction in the next few weeks? Very interesting. And then one final comment. I do believe that there is a fertile ground for an immigration bill, contrary to what a lot of people might say, for precisely the reasons that Henry has been talking about. There will be a struggle for the soul and the future of the Republican Party, and on one side you're going to have people like Jeb Bush and Lindsey Graham and Mitch Daniels, who say this is crazy if we don't start to reach out in a different way and move this issue of immigration off the agenda for now, we're in terrible shape. And there are going to be Republicans where Obama can reach out and find some of that common ground, but he's going to have some problems with his own base, and that's what also happens with a second-term president. Always, your base thinks now they can have everything they want because you're not shackled by the need to run for re-election, and it goes in exactly the opposite direction. So that's another challenge that Obama has, not just winning over Republicans in the House, but fending off some of your own strongest supporters.
Thank you very much, Norm. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure you have many questions. There'll be assistants wandering the room with microphones. If you could identify yourselves. And again, I want to thank our assistants, Jennifer Marsko, who prepared this handout on the 2014 Senate races, and Andrew Rugg, who works assiduously on the monthly AEI political report. I think this has information you won't find anywhere else in Washington this fast from the exit poll results. All right, questions. We'll start here in the front, and please identify yourself.
Thank you. Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook magazine, and of course very interested in the Latino vote. But I'm wondering if you're going to see, as we did in 2008, a big difference between the exit polls, which I think are just not reliable, and the actual voting count, and when you think that will happen. In 2008, they showed that the Latino vote made 9%, consisted of 9% of the total electorate, but the actual number was 7.4%. And then my big question is, 9% or 7% of what? If you just, it looks like the total number of voters are going to be less this year than in 2008. So I'm wondering, when does that come out? And just another little thing I have to say, immigration is not just about Latinos, and I think Republicans have a great chance to talk about immigration as work opportunities, the growing Asian immigrant community, and also the fact that the immigration bill that will pass first is giving permanent green cards to foreign students who studied in STEM, and they will mainly be Asians.
Michael.
Well, the exit poll, the exit poll consortium massages the data that initially comes in. One of the things we've noticed with the exit poll is that both because of interviewer bias but also respondent bias, it tends to attract more Democrats, and in the 2008 Democratic primary attract more Obama voters than Hillary Clinton voters. Learning is cumulative, and the people that work on this every 2 and 4 years have learned something. I was working with Arnon Mishkin, the head of the Fox decision desk, and they were over in Rockefeller Center spending about 4 hours in the afternoon basically They got the data adjusted for the response, and they got data down to a 49-49 top line, which turns out to be within 1% of the vote for each candidate. And unlike past years like 2004, some of the state exit polls were not way out of whack with what the result turned out to be. In fact, they turned out to be pretty close. So the exit poll is intended to tell you what each group thinks, but it doesn't tell you with complete exactitude how many people there are in that group. It's not designed to produce an accurate number on that. It doesn't get numbers that are too far off, but we need to, examine the electorate from other points of view and take other surveys into account. And I think, don't talk about tenths of a number or something, because you're rounding it off to a full percentage gives you an impression. If you take that as an impressionistic thing, the Hispanic number did go up to, I think, 10% this time. We'll see. There's also the category when they ask race, they have this group called other, and there's 7% in others. They're probably also mainly people of Latin American origin whose race categories from where they come from are considerably different from our own. So immigration, I think what Norm said is right. I think if the Democrats and the people that sought the 06-07 legislation have a limited degree of legalization, or if you want to call it that, amnesty, I think there's a path to a compromise legislation.
We have 3 questions right here. I'm going to start with this gentleman, and if you could tell us your question, and then I think this gentleman right here, and then we'll try to answer them this way. We'll cluster the questions together. Was there another question? Did you have a question? You have a question right here. So these 2 people right here, if you could tell us what your questions are, go ahead.
I'm speaking on behalf of an endangered species, the old northeast suburban Philadelphia mainline Republicans, right? You don't see very many of them anymore. And as I've watched my dad write countless checks to the Republican Party. And I spoke with him last night, and he says, why should I write checks to the Republican Party when this demographic issue has been going on since, and he cited Ben Wattenberg's book from the 70s. And he says, listen, this has been on the horizon forever, and now in 2012, the Republican Party is just waking up to it. So my question is, where has the Republican Party, not the Hill, but party leadership been on this issue? And also, Mr. Barone, is there any hope for the Northeast Republicans?
Okay. And if you could ask this gentleman, if you could tell us what your question is, and then this gentleman right here, Patrick in the back. Okay.
Sure. I wonder if any of you might comment on the outcome of the election at a level that a lot of us inside the Beltway ignore, which is in the governorships and the state legislatures. And, one of the things that people don't see is that in the Constitution, the only people that actually have the constitutional ability to supervise Washington are state legislators if they decide to propose amendments to the Constitution. So what happened at the state level, and how does that impact what happens in Washington?
And we'll take this 3rd question right here, this gentleman back here.
Yes, my name is Kami Bhatt, and I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about the soul of Republican Party. Last week, I was at the RNC to make some calls in their boiler room, and I saw one gentleman in front of me waiting to pick up some Spanish food. And he has shared, deport Pedro. And I became a little concerned because I thought next time he might have deport Mohammed. That is my first name. Michael Steele made RNC very, very inclusive. Mitt Romney is one of the most inclusive person. He helped Haitian refugee when he was bishop of his church. I have empathy for these people who wear these kind of shirt about deportation of Latino. But Obama didn't waste $6 billion writing more check to the people who have more babies. So my question is, when is Republican are going to lose in long term by making, depending just on a certain segment of the population? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I should point out that Ben Wattenberg is here today, the author of the 1970 book with Richard Scammon, The Real Majority.
Let me take a crack at it. It actually deals in part with the first two questions. There are going to be some modest shifts in state legislative chambers overall. Democrats will pick up a few. But I think there's a larger point to be made here, and that is, and some of it relates to money and what's happening in this post-Citizens United world. The real impact is not at the presidential level, as we saw. All that super PAC money didn't change much. Presidential candidates have plenty of recognition and plenty of resources on their own. You start to move further down, and then you really do see the impact. And at the state level, we had a few $1 million that went into Kansas's primary elections that was targeted at knocking off the moderate Republicans and succeeded. We had the Koch brothers this time, who were deeply involved in Kansas, do the same thing in Arkansas and had pretty much the same effect. We've seen it before in North Carolina. And, you know, when you look at that, one of the things that's happening is the state legislative chambers are becoming actually more radicalized than what we see at the national level, and it has an impact. And I think, for example, you know, if you look at the comments on rape by Todd Akin and Richard Murdoch, they resonated, but there were other things as well. In Virginia, the Obama people went in with a campaign to win over more women that was based far more on the invasive ultrasound initiative that really resonated with a lot of people. And you're going to see actions by state legislative chambers that may make this message coming from the more pragmatic leaders of the party at the national level a little bit less resonant. It's going to be a real challenge for them as they move ahead. And you know, just a quick comment on the Asian vote, which a lot of people thought was going to break more for the Republicans, which is just like this perennial notion that the Jewish vote is just waiting to move over to the Republican side. And Sheldon Adelson spent many, many millions of dollars based on that premise, and it's going to come out probably almost exactly where it's been for the last 10 elections. And the Asian vote from the exit polls is not far off from where it was in 2008. And I think it's in part for just the reason that Muhammad suggested, that even if you have a lot of educated Asians, some who've been denied visas, others who've come over with high educations and then are being forced to go back in other places, they don't see themselves as different from Hispanics on this issue. It is the same sort of larger sense of you don't want people like me here. And if you can't change that message in the way that Henry was suggesting, you got a bigger problem, because that's also a growing share of the electorate.
On the last question, I think I don't want to use, and I think the Republican Party should banish the notion of reaching out. I think reaching out says we're starting from a position of our own ideas, and we're going to bring them to you. What we need to do is talk about inclusion. And the first step of inclusion is listening, and listening to your aspirations, your values, and frankly, what you don't like about us. And then figuring out where we have common ground. You know, one thing I want to, the survey of Asian immigrants into America, of Asians generally, points out that over half of them do not belong to any sort of Christian religion. So if you start your political statements as and equate Judeo-Christian heritage with American heritage, you're already telling half of the Asians that you're not part of that heritage. Little things like that that Republicans need to think about. Start with listening and not assuming that you not only that you're correct, but also that the person who you're trying to talk with is somebody who automatically understands you.
Michael, very quickly on Northeastern moderates.
Well, you know, some people yearn for the days of Nelson Rockefeller. Those days are gone. You know, but at the same time, Pennsylvania's House delegation, I believe, is going to be 13, with the aid of some creative redistricting, both in the last cycle, and this one is going to be 13-5 Republicans. So that says that Republicans are by no means extinct in some parts of the Northeast. Basically, you've got a combination in New York and New Jersey of gentry liberals, immigrants, and so forth, large black populations that tilt those districts Democratic. You know, those old professional areas, the high-income voters. Mitt Romney did do better than John McCain or previous Republican candidates with high-income voters, and I think there's been a Democratic trend from 1992 through 2008 in a lot of the affluent non-southern suburbs. Bucks, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery counties, Pennsylvania were 61% for the first George Bush in '88 and was 57% for Obama. I haven't drilled down to the county data, but I'm expecting to see some, at least modest gains for Romney in those areas, and we'll see. The plight of the Republican Party, the Republican Party faces some challenges, which we've been speaking to. So does the Democratic Party. White Catholics voted 59-35 for Mitt Romney. That's a group that voted on Richard Nixon, voted 22% for Richard Nixon and 78% for Richard Nixon. The parties compete for different kind of voters, and the score was 50-48 Democratic at President and 50-48 or something like it Republican for the House. So I think the Republicans face challenges but not doom.
I'm going to take 3 questions from this side of the room, starting with Wayne Vallis, our former colleague here at AEI many years ago.
Yes, Wayne Vallis, former AEI alumnus and a Richard Nixon White House alumnus. 2 questions. Henry, why don't you let us know a couple of potential Republican leaders who could give that Richard Nixon speech honestly and sincerely? And then my other question is, did the early voting in states like Virginia, Florida, and so on lead to a big Obama edge that helped put him over the top in these early voting?
There's a question right here. And then Jen in the far back.
From what I can hear is that the Republican Party is a party of people who like to keep their wealth, evangelicals, and white males. So if that's the case, as you said, it's a demographic that's not expanding. It seems like your only possibility is voter suppression.
At the very back.
I'm John Green. Norm, and anyone else, but since you addressed this sort of specifically around Senate relationships and that, so Harry Reid said before the election that if Romney won, they would not be able to work together. And then after the election, he said to Republicans, hey, I need you guys to, it's kind of along the lines that you were saying, that bust-out group. But then now he's talking about going nuclear and taking away the filibuster. And to me, that optically suggests that we get deadlock if we gridlock if we go there.
Chris Christie, Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels, Condoleezza Rice, I hope Paul Ryan, a number of people whose names we haven't heard of yet, but perhaps Rubio, Scott Walker. I think there are many, can I say many more Republicans at all stages and walks of life, from the highest office to the lowest volunteer, who believe that and who will start to speak in those terms and in those language, because it's why they're in the Republican Party, it's why they want to run for office, and they want to stop being caricatured as something that they're not.
Michael, early voting?
Yeah, the signs on early voting. There were signs that early voting was not producing as big a Democratic edge in 2012 as it did in '08, and I think that will ultimately turn out to be true, but it did provide a sufficient votes for Democrats in Florida, Virginia, and Ohio. So, the signs were that they did pretty well, if not as well as 2008, and they did well enough.
Just on the one brief comment on the early voting, Karl Rove, whose analysis was not terribly distinguished this time either. Also, I got kind of bemused when he said this early voting is not going to work because they've got this massive effort to get early votes in the parts of Ohio where there's been the war on coal, and those are Republicans who are going to come forward. And I thought, so what he's basically saying is Plouffe and Axelrod are morons. They're just getting anybody who says he's a Democrat out to the polls. Of course, they were targeting particular individuals in an extraordinarily successful way. And you don't just need to look at the overall numbers, it's who they were turning out. And they did that in a fashion that will probably be enhanced in the future, in part because of efforts to block votes on Election Day, to clog up the lines at the polls, and the kinds of things we saw in Florida especially. And those voting wars are going to be accelerated as we look to the future. John, on the filibuster, you're absolutely right. You have a more liberal contingent of Democrats coming in with this election, all of whom have signed on to significant filibuster reform. And Reid, who did not want it a year ago, endorsed it more recently. And I don't think they can move forward without doing something on the filibuster. The question is twofold. One is when. If you move on it now, you poison the well in terms of a fiscal cliff, broad bipartisan compromise that may be different if you wait until January. And you could potentially do it by reaching out and finding some Republican support for more modest changes. Carl Levin, for example, has come up with a proposal that's much more modest than what many of the Democrats want. It mostly focuses on the motion to proceed, but could include a couple of other areas where you might find a bipartisan buy-in that would take the issue, at least take the temperature down. But if that doesn't happen, then the Senate next year becomes a more unruly and more partisan place, and that, I think, is entirely possible, and it would make governing in the next couple of years even more of a challenge.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just wanted to ask Norm about the House versus Senate. You have all these gangs in the Senate, in the moderate side. Is there any chance for a moderate House gang to form itself at some point? They've tried over the years, as you know, and I think Matt Dowd or somebody mentioned that he's trying to organize something. Can you comment on any sort of moderate organization to help Boehner in the House?
Well, Norm mentioned earlier the couple moderates that got elected, but the number of what were there, 44 or something blue dogs, and Rahm Emanuel did a brilliant job of recruiting many House purportedly moderate Democrats, and who were elected in 2006 and 2008. They're almost all gone. And, the rules of the House tend to give control to the leadership of the majority party as long as it has a sufficient majority and cohesiveness within its caucus or conference. And I think, on some substantive issues, as Norm suggested, there can be some problems. And I'm not sure that Boehner has committed himself as strongly as Speaker Dennis Hastert did to the idea that he won't bring forward anything that's not supported by a majority of the majority party. But he hasn't brought many things forward like that, and I don't sense him. There just aren't many moderate Democrats, and there's some Republicans that are open to some of these ideas, but those Northeast Republicans, Mike Castle, ran for the Senate and had an unfortunate result for himself and for the Republican Party in the primary. So,
and that's right. But I think the problem for Boehner, who is a legislator, would kind of like to find those resolutions, is he doesn't have a leadership that's behind him on that. There is a group, the Center Aisle Caucus, which has had a significant and robust membership, and there are no more, by voting records, moderate or liberal Republicans in the House. None. Zero. But there are plenty of conservative problem solvers. The problem that they have is almost all of them have been told by the Club for Growth, we got $3 million bounties on your heads if you lift those heads up out of the foxhole. And that becomes a serious challenge, and that's where you get back to some of these larger problems. And it's a question of whether there's any way to free them up a little bit to move in a different direction. For many of them, I would say, if you look at, for example, the House Appropriations Committee in the past has been kind of a model of bipartisanship, working together. But you'd get these bills where there would be give and take and everybody get a little something, and then you'd bring them to the floor and they'd have unanimous support. And then the Republicans would vote against their own bills because that was, you were operating in a unified way. It's a parliamentary process. On the Democratic side, the number of blue dogs has dwindled dramatically, but you've still got 20 or 25 moderates. That's people like Colin Peterson in Minnesota, as well as the few remaining Southerners. But you've got some from the West Coast as well, whose voting records are more moderate. A couple of business people from the Northeast. For Pelosi to keep her party together, it's a more fractious party. She has to find ways to bring them into the fold, and you see a few more, at least, opportunities to compromise. But the fact is that the caucuses are moving further apart, even as there's a need to pull them together, and it's not clear that leaders have the capacity to do that right now.
Hey, one thing I just want to add is it's not just a uniparty phenomena of the loss of moderates. You know, after the president's health care bill passed, people who voted against it were primary challenge. And, you know, Larry Kissel to beat his primary challenge, but he lost election this time. Forget the guy who was the head of the Blue Dogs who Steve Sutherland beat. But
Peterson. No, Alan Boyd.
Alan Boyd.
Yeah.
Alan Boyd was primary challenge, and then he lost his election. This time around, the Pennsylvania legislature, gerrymandered the state for Republicans. They put Tim Holden, who's been a blue dog since 1992, into a safe Democratic district. First thing that popped up was a progressive primary challenge. They took him out because he voted against the president's health care plan. I was watching the Daily Cause site on the day of the Pennsylvania primary, and they were as exultant as the Club for Growth was when they beat David Dewhurst. The people that Norm cited who survived were people who voted against the president's health care bill. And the question would be, if John Barrow hadn't have been redistricted, would he have been primary challenge in a seat that was 40% black and 60% for President Obama? It's both parties' bases that are moving their parties to the sides of the aisle that they're on.
I think some of the Republicans, Norm says they've become radicalized. I think what they would argue is that state legislatures and governors in states like California and Illinois and New York, and to some extent the Congress, including times when Republicans have been in majorities there, are radical in overspending and sending us over, onto the road to Greece. By constantly increasing government as a share of GDP, which it's at a higher rate than it was before. I don't think these views are crazy, irrational, or whatever. They're views that rational people can hold, and they would argue that the appropriations process, which, as Norm pointed out, was very bipartisan, and Newt Gingrich, when he became Speaker, tried to undermine that with less than complete success, has tended to produce spending that puts us on a trajectory towards trillion-dollar deficits a year. So that's the sort of thing we argue about in politics, and some people don't agree with, what other people think.
Ben, we have two questions here and back here.
Thanks. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report, and I want to put this in I want to put this question in a framework that begins with a comment that I think Michael made at the outset, and if I'm misquoting or interpreting, start there, Michael. That in certain ways this election was the sort of big government versus small government perspectives on governance in this country. And then listening to Henry's observation about the exit poll and the overwhelming number, the 80-20 number cares about people like me. If the issues that define big government versus small government come down to things like Obamacare or tax rates returning to earlier rates on high net worth individuals, or even Dodd-Frank, is the argument, is the way to talk about those issues big government versus small government, or is it to talk about it in terms of fairness and equity? And doesn't the exit poll suggest that that's ultimately how the population sees those issues? And I would just tag on to that the only people that I hear talking about that this is an election between those people who want big government and small government are Republicans who want the world to think that what Democrats are all about is that they want big government. But I don't hear Democrats talking about the fact that they want big government. It seems to me we want effective government, and I just throw in the tagline that if you believe, as many do, that Sandy was a kicker for Barack Obama in the closing days of the election, and had something to do with the change in the Pew poll from 47-47 to 50-47, then it seems to me that also says that arguing the big government versus small government is really wasted rhetoric, and what we want is government that is effective, number one, and number two, we want government to do those things that are, that demonstrate a sense of care about people like me.
Put this question on the table first, and just as a footnote, while Jen's taking the mic, fewer than half, 42%, said Obama's hurricane response was an important factor in their vote, and 54% said it wasn't an important factor. But still, 42% is a big number. And your question, sir.
Gerald Chandler here. What do you think that President Obama is, how much is President Obama willing to accept of something like Simpson Bowles? In that program, they call for about 70% cuts and about 30% revenue increases. He campaigned against Romney by saying you're going to lose this or you're going to lose that to all kinds of groups. He never opened his mouth suggesting that he was willing to cut anything. He never talked about how the deficit was important. So now that he's been reelected, how much is he willing to accept some kind of program like that, which would cause, instead of 100% cuts, 70% cuts in many, many things?
Michael?
Well, he frames the issue, he who frames the issue tends to determine the outcome of the election, and Republicans frame it as big government versus small government. Democrats frame it as caring and fairness and so forth. You try to frame an issue, and I think, you could argue that either framing sets the issue. Federal government's been spending 24 or 25% of GDP, and during the first Obama administration against Norm in the post-World War II days of 21%. That sounds like bigger government to me. There's various arguments. It's interesting. When I went back over, in course of preparing a kind of e-book that I'm working on for AEI on the second Clinton term and the budget agreements, which did not include a tax rate increase. In fact, included a capital gains tax cut in 1997, and the work that Clinton and Newt Gingrich embarked on to at least think seriously about entitlement reform. These things can be done, and one of the things that got the budget balanced, part of it was the Clinton tax increases in '93, supported by Democrats only. Part of it was getting rid of the savings and loan crisis. Part of it is greater economic growth. When you have robust economic growth, revenue starts pouring in, and it seems to me that, as a non-expert, it starts pouring in at rates that most projections don't project. And that's one of the ways that you grow revenues, and the government is suddenly suffused with money. California's progressive income tax can bring in huge revenues. It's also, they think they lost $2 billion because the Facebook IPO didn't go as well as they expected, but because they have a very progressive state tax system. The temptation then is to spend all the money and then get a government baseline budget that you can't pay for when times are not as well. But growth does produce revenue.
Yeah, just, if you discuss this argument at the abstract level, it has more traction if you talk about reducing government. It's when you get down to concrete levels, and that's why neither the Romney budget nor the Ryan budget get into specifics. We'll cut discretionary domestic spending by 20% overall, but we're not going to tell you what the specifics are, because if you do, you get into cuts in food safety and meat inspection, cuts in small airports, because you're going to have to cut out the FAA, in health research, in FEMA, in Homeland Security. That's where the programs are. That's where the money is. Big Bird doesn't help very much on that front. I think that's part of the argument that we have ahead. Obama very specifically said he wanted a deal that would have $1 in revenue increases for every $2.50 in budget cuts. So we're talking about a 30-70 ratio being pretty much there. He endorsed the Gang of Six plan. That was the Coburn and Durbin et al. Plan back in 2011, and has made it pretty clear that he understands that accepting especially cutbacks in Medicare and Medicaid in the future growth as part of an overall deal just has to be done if you can also do the other side of the coin. So my guess is, and I'm quite confident of it, that if Simpson and Bowles and Coburn and Chambliss and Durbin and Conrad and Bennett all agree on a deal and it fits the Simpson-Bowles projections, Obama will endorse it immediately.
Yeah, on the small government question, smaller government has been a core Republican principle for innumerable decades. It was not something invented by the conservative movement. It was something that Dwight Eisenhower talked about. It was something that Thomas Dewey talked about. That's not something that's going to go away, nor should it go away. But I do think there are a couple of things. One is that when you're talking about caring about people like you first have to listen. That's what I was saying to our friend from Pakistan. Some of the things that Republicans can do to address that question don't involve the size of government in terms of a monetary sense. Secondly, I'd like to, there's two things Ronald Reagan said in his speeches when he gave his famous speech for Barry Goldwater. Ronald Reagan endorsed an expansion in that speech of health insurance for senior citizens. What he said was that he favored a smaller plan to help people who were poorer off rather than creating a one-size-fits-all government plan. That's Ronald Reagan endorsing Barry Goldwater in 1964. What he said at the end of that speech was that he didn't believe that there was such a thing as there left or right. There was only up or down. All too often, conservatives have fallen into the left versus right rhetoric, which in fact Reagan himself did not like to use. In 1976, the Republican Party was faced with extinction. It had 1/3 of the member of the House of Representatives. Over half of those would have been defined by any neutral observer as centrist or center-left. The conservative movement was thought to be as irrelevant to American life as the pharaohs. And Ronald Reagan went into CPAC, which could have been held in an audience room smaller than this in 1977, and gave a speech called A New Republican Party that he basically outlined how he was going to win in 4 years. And one of the things he did in that speech was talk about, when you talk about your programs, when you talk about what you want to do, talk about how it'll work. Don't talk about it in terms of ideology. Ronald Reagan in 1977, at the depth of the nadir of the Republican Party, basically saying how to create a phoenix-like rebirth. It's time we listen to Ronald Reagan.
We have 3 questions here, and then here, and here, and then we'll let Ben Wattenberg, our colleague, have the last word. And I also want to note there are actually a few people who started with us at Election Watch in 1982. I don't know whether you want to raise your hands, but anyway, we're very grateful that you've stayed with us for that long. Okay, Pandry, there.
Thank you. Elizabeth Sinclair, Long and Foster Real Estate. With respect to Norm, and certainly Dick Morris and Karl Rove don't need my defenses, but I'd just like to say I know it's quite easy to make fun of people when they've lost, but Morris and Rove have distinguished themselves in many other ways and worked awfully hard for the campaign. As someone who also thought that Mitt Romney would win big time, and am now taking a lot of flack from all my liberal friends and family, I'd just like to ask Michael Barone whether he could share some of his reasoning on why he thought this brilliant man, Michael Barone and Charles Krauthammer, thought that Romney would win handily, with excuses to Charles Krauthammer because he didn't use that adverb.
Could the panel comment on what effect this is going to have on the Supreme Court appointments that are probably going to come up in the next 4 years?
Yes, Frank Fletcher. The economy might be recovering, but if the recovery isn't complete, or if growth is tepid and slow and jobs don't come back by the time of the next presidential campaign, how will that affect the types of policies that candidates will propose and their receptivity? In other words, different solutions and how people might change electorally.
I think that given polling data, given the uncertainty of it these days, I think there were a lot of reasonable predictions you could have made from getting Barack Obama up to 332 would have been a reasonable prediction and appears to have come true. I think that it's, getting over 300 for Mitt Romney, I think, was within the realm of possibility, or a reasonable person can so conclude. There are lots of issues in polling now that that Carlin has been following closely for AEI, and that are genuinely troubling to a lot of serious pollsters. Polling procedures were developed in a nation that had universal landline telephones and a population that answered the phone. We do not live in such a nation anymore. Pew Research has found only 9% of calls initiated result in a complete interview last year. In 1997, it was 36%. Is that 9% representative of the larger public? We're not sure. The exit poll intake has typically not been representative of the general public, which is a different kind of poll. So there are questions to be asked here and things to be learned further. So, it's, on predictions, it's, there are a lot of, I think there's a lot of predictions that are out there. They basically are, where are those 8 target states going? If they'd gone differently, you would have seen a different result. And the Electoral College, as I say, what looks like a landslide in the Electoral College is not a landslide in popular votes. In 2008, Barack Obama got 53% of the vote and 365 electoral votes. 53-46, I think, is usually regarded as a solid win, but not a landslide. But you get a landslide of electoral votes usually when you do that.
As somebody, I don't begrudge anything that Michael or Dick Morris or said about any election, because anybody who does this with any degree of seriousness knows how bleeping hard it is to do. I agree with Michael that anything between the ranges he talked about was entirely reasonable and consistent with the data that were before us. As a partisan, I sat down and, I'm an analyst and a partisan. I have an analyst hat when I write and a partisan's heart. And when I sat down on Sunday to write my piece, I took hours to put the data together. I wrote it, and when I concluded to myself what I had to write, I couldn't write for an hour because I was sick. Okay? But one thing I'd like to say about our friends on the right, too, is that when I did publish it, the comments on National Review Online basically said that I should be read out of the conservative movement. And one person accused me of peddling fear porn. I think I had a more favorable reaction from the viewers on the Daily Cause than I did on National Review Online. I think what that, yeah.
As many obscene comments as I did?
No, you mean from either? From
the left commentators, a lot of commenters, a lot of them are scurrilous,
Oh, no, look, there is hyper-partisanship on the left. There's hyper-partisanship on the right. What I did get was not an obscene comment on the Daily Cause, but somebody said, I sounded reasonable. How could I work for the hacks at AEI and the bozos at NRO? Okay. What we need to do generally in our discussion with each other is to recognize that everyone in this discussion is an American. Everyone in this discussion is actually not a hack or a bozo or a tyrant in the making, but is somebody who is trying to argue and think their way through these problems that are very difficult and very complex. If somebody had said they were going to be a pundit and promised that Barack Obama was going to win 59% of the vote and sweep 49 states, well, that person probably is not in the realm of reality. But that's not where anybody who was serious was. And this was the hardest election in our lifetime, the hardest election since Nixon-Humphrey in '68 to call.
I just can't resist saying that I put Michael in a very different category than Dick Morris. But that aside, on the Supreme Court, we don't know what vacancies there will be. We have several justices in their 70s. You know, in this world today, being in your 70s, thank goodness, does not mean that you're approaching the end of your life. But we also know that we've had justices with health problems. We know we have justices who smoke too much and maybe have other vices that could have an impact. But, you know, actuarial tables don't help us very much. There's a pretty good chance that in the next 4 years there'll be 1, 2, or 3 vacancies. Some of it depends on when those vacancies emerge. If you have a 55-45 Democratic Senate and there's a vacancy, Barack Obama has a little bit more leeway to pick somebody with a stronger ideological edge than if it's a 51-49 Senate or even a Senate that goes the other way. But I think you're much more likely in any event to get somebody who would be somewhere in the broad center of legal discourse. And there are a lot of options out there. In many ways, more interesting is the impact that we'll see now with Obama having 4 years and maybe a little bit more of an understanding, curious that he didn't have it as a constitutional law professor, of the importance of putting forward nominees for appeals courts and district courts. He was really slow in moving to that through his first couple of years, and there are a lot of vacancies there. Now he's got opportunities to fill those vacancies, and the controversy over the filibuster may end up being more, yet again, in a replay of the Bush years, over judicial nominations than it comes over executive branch nominations.
On the question of the stagnant economy in a few years, I think Obama neutralized Romney on the economy this year. If it goes on for a lot longer, it's hard to know. But it was interesting to me in the exit polls that 53% of the voters still blame George Bush for current economic problems and 38% Barack Obama. So you can see how he neutralized.
Just a comment on that. If you look at the most recent analysis of Reinhardt and Rogoff, who are, you know, just off the charts superb in doing straightforward analysis, Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, you know, looking at this downturn in the context of other downturns triggered by financial crises and debt problems, which are very different from a typical recession, we've actually come out of it better than most others, and we've clearly come out of it better than other countries that experienced it in a global way. And if you look at the forecasts made by Moody Analytics and others, basically it was, regardless of who's the president, we'll see 12 million jobs created over the next 4 years. Now, they may be right and they may be wrong, and their prognostications on economic issues are nowhere better than ours have been on political issues. And lots of things can emerge, including war, other kinds of economic issues, trade wars, whatever it may be. But there's a pretty good chance that we're going to start to see some significant recovery, and there are incipient signs out there. And one part of it is another area where I think the Obama policies faltered, not moving rapidly on the housing market. People, you know, Americans' savings have been wrapped up in their homes. And you're not going to get consumption or confidence if your savings is not only taking a hit, but is not going to come back. Now, as you start to see home prices rise and the market shift, that will probably bring itself a significant additional level of consumer confidence, and that could feed on some level of growth. But to be realistic, we're not going to get those levels of growth, 4%, 5% in the next couple of years that emerge if you've got recovery from a typical recession. It's going to take longer than that, and it's probably going to be at a lower level.
There's one question here, and then, Ben, you can have the last word with this question.
Linwood Bragan with the Capstown Council for Policy and Ethics. I was wondering, with the deep divisions within the nation that we've seen, the near split that's there, the division between those people who are religious, families, families that are made up without two-parent families, the deep divisions that are there, the culture wars that have been spoken of so frequently. What about a healing or a unifying of the culture, as you've spoken about Mr. Olson, with people such as the incendiary Alan Grayson returning to Congress, not on the right side of the spectrum, but as things would be there, Mr. Ornstein, and then Mr. Barone, as you're out there, and Carlin, as y'all are constantly looking at cultural effects and efforts, what happens within our national culture? Will it be a time of healing or further division?
Okay. And Pat, can you go to Ben Wattenberg here in the front? Right up here.
Hi, I walked in just after Carlin was talking about.
Can you speak up, Ben?
What?
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I say I walked in just as you were finishing your remarks on Dick Scammon, and I wanted to say I'm sure they were. Carlin, who I've known, institutional diamond.
Could you repeat that, Ben?
What about Norm? Ben, hold the mic.
Norm is an institutional diamond in the rough. Okay. Dick Scammon used to say that the closeness of the was
I'll
close
repeat
to
it.
half and half. It was 51-49, something like that. That in a winner-take-all situation, winner in a take-all situation can be tilted by the tiniest group of voters. After all, you only need to vote to say who is deciding. He said the votes of left-handed Lithuanians. That was his sort of. The winner-take-all has a lot of Jewish community that God gave Arabs the oil and Jews the electoral college because they were clustered in they were clustered in swing states in Florida.
Norm, you can respond to the diamond in the rough.
Yeah, right. So it protects small minorities because it makes them, particularly in a close state, enormous prizes. And finally, I just want to surface again an idea I have had. The idea that who's going to be the leader of this incredibly good country can be a tie, and that so many tens of millions of people are really disenfranchised because they live in a blue state or a red state. My thought was, and I think it should be controversial, that if you awarded by federal statute or constitutional, I don't know what it would be, one electoral vote to the winner of the popular vote, that would eliminate a tie, and it would make everybody feel that if they wanted to feel that way, it would make everyone feel that they were part of the process, even if they live in a 70-30 swing state, red or blue. Say, well, I went in and voted for.
Yeah. Thought about some of these issues.
Yeah, you know, a couple of points that have been made. First is it's a rare election that isn't decided in some fashion at the margins, you know, and yet does result in an electoral college bonus. Ronald Reagan, remember, got 51% of the popular votes in a three-way race and won an enormous surplus of electoral votes. Democrats tried to make the case, and when the Republicans swept all these Senate seats, that a shift of 50,000 votes would have given Democrats back like 7 Senate seats. And, you know, so what? Because basically you have a tide and it moves in one direction and it tilts things in one particular way. That's always going to be the case, and it's going to be the case that people who lose are going to try and find some rationale for why they either really didn't lose or why it doesn't mean so much. The Electoral College has some really serious challenges now. We can thank God at one level that we didn't end up with another 2000, which we easily could have had, where you had the winner of the popular vote lose the Electoral College. It would have been flipped this time around. And I must say, I was sort of, at one level, deliciously awaiting the Wall Street Journal editorials that after the 2000 election said, oh, come on, grow up, this is the these are the rules, this is how it happens, saying, go to the barricades. And it would be flipped around the other way around. But it's a kind of crisis that's now in the making. And it is a problem, as Ben had said, that we have 41 states where basically the outcome is determined. The good news for people in those 41 states is you don't have to sit back like a goose being force-fed for foie gras and have commercials that just are the deluge upon you. I don't know how many saw the video of 22 consecutive bile-filled commercials in Ohio that somebody put together. But it's a problem that we need to deal with. And one way to deal with it is providing some kind of an electoral college bonus for the popular vote winner and preserve some of the features of the electoral college that we don't need to talk about in detail, but that we have long supported and view as valuable. And just one other point, which is, keep in mind, if you talk about the national popular vote and how wonderful that would be and we could avoid some of these nightmares, imagine an election like 1960. Popular vote nationwide is divided by 1/10%. You don't impound just the ballot boxes in Florida. You impound them across the nation. You have an army of lawyers going to Florida. You've got regiment after regiment. Maybe it would be the biggest jobs program in the history of the country going everywhere and taking months to decide. It's not so great. And just one of our great problems is the coarsening of culture more generally. And it's reflected in the Alan Graysons and the Alan Wests and others. And you got them across the board. And it is, we live in a culture now where lying brings no sense of approbation or shame or cost. You get caught in a lie, and the lesson that you learn these days is you double down on it and you get your own cable television show or you become a political superstar. And it is something we really have to deal with, I think, at a larger level. And I actually think what Henry has been talking about, we need a vibrant conservative Republican Party. We need two parties that go at each other but also recognize, fact is, most of these issues, there's an enormous amount of common ground. These are not black and white questions. But it's got to be done at a different level, and it's got to be done with a different set of attitudes. And I think he has, and there are others. Steve Hayward, who was here for a long time, wrote just a wonderfully interesting piece on the future of the conservative movement. We're not talking about Northeastern liberals here who really, frankly, have no home at this point. I don't know what will happen. But we're talking about card-carrying conservatives who understand that if we keep going down this path, tribalism could turn this into a country that makes all those nice words about how we're not red states and blue states, we're the United States, into we're red states and blue states and we're going to the mattresses.
Well, one way, of course, to avoid the tie in the Electoral College is for Congress to set the size of the House of Representatives at an even number. But then you might have a tie for Speaker of the House. So, because that would give us, that would give us non-tie. On the values question, we have, I think that sometimes we forget that the United States, during most of its history, has been a culturally diverse country from the colonial times. I think those of us who grew up with or remember the sort of universal popular cultures of the radio entertainment programs, the movies of the 1930s and 40s, television in the 50s, the early 60s, there was a media setup where there was a huge advantage to presenting a popular culture that appealed to everybody. And you had this sort of period in which we had a very strong universal popular culture in some cases. We don't live in that kind of country anymore. We have 133 cable channels. We've lost the language of the universal culture. We have differing values as we did in the past. The founders established a federal government with limited powers, with a lot of room for states, localities, and voluntary associations to do much of society's work. And they specifically made the federal government neutral on religion. States could have an established church if they wanted to, or they didn't have to have one, and we certainly would not have one nationally. We were going to just leave religion. Federal government was going to be neutral on that. And that that mostly worked, although there were difficulties. We had something called the Civil War because you suddenly got a federal government issue, slavery in the territories. The territories were, Congress was given specific power to regulate the territories, so you couldn't avoid that issue. And we had civil war. One of the problems with big government, in my judgment, and I think it is a bigger government, is that when you have something like Obamacare, it suddenly becomes a federal issue whether or not your insurance policy should cover the $9 a month that you need to pay for contraceptives at Walmart. That's less than the price of 2 pumpkin lattes at Starbucks. But it became a national issue when we had a speaker at in the primetime TV hour at the Democratic National Convention speaking on this issue and advocating her position. A lot of people in this country have strong views based on their personal moral beliefs or their personal religious beliefs on both sides of this issue, beliefs which are not crazy, irrational, or vicious, but they happen to be different. And we have to, big government makes this a national issue, whereas the founders' idea was that a lot of things like this would be handled in different ways so that people could reach different resolutions nationally. And so I think, the Supreme Court made abortion a national issue in 1973. People have very strong moral views on both sides on an issue. And beliefs which are very important in their lives. We cannot expect those to be expelled from politics when government makes those decisions.
Henry, you get the last word today.
People talk a lot about bipartisanship or unity. I think there are types of false unity that we should talk about. One is the false unity where we pretend that moral values are things that can be laid at political doors. I think Michael was just very eloquent about why that has never been and why it can't be. The other type of false unity is when one party says to the other that unity is on my terms. And when I hear a lot of times people on the right, I get the impression that unity will be fine as long as we're only talking about the shade of red from rose to ruby. And on the left, the last 2 days, the underlying assumption has been we really won the election, even though you did win the House. And the unity is going to be debating the shade of blue that you can accept from periwinkle to navy. And I think what Americans want is for us to look at America as marriage. And the Democrats and the Republicans are two spouses, and the country is the family. And what you learn when you're in a marriage is that you have to authentically listen to the other spouse. You have to understand what the other spouse's viewpoint is, even if you disagree with it. And if you care more about the family than you do about yourself, then you have to make accommodations to authentically respond to the other person's deepest desires and aspirations, even if it would discomfort you or you disagree with it. We will have a real bipartisanship when we can have red and blue come together and debate about the shades of purple, understanding that they won't get everything that they want. And until and unless that can happen, we will only be talking about false unity, which means that civility will continue to decrease and political war will continue to happen.
I'd like to thank all my wonderful panelists and colleagues here at AEI and thank all of you for coming, and we'll see you in 2 years.